Lots of seats up towards the front. I want to congratulate and thank all those people who braved the elements to come out and join us today. It's the beginning of the Washington Winter Pride. But good morning and welcome to all of you. My name is Jerry Firestein. I am at the Middle East Institute as the director of the new Center for Global Affairs that we've launched here. MEI is pleased to collaborate again with James Zobey and his team at the Arab American Institute, our co-sponsor for today's public release of the report, Middle East 2016, Current Conditions and the Road Ahead. This is MEI's final public program for 2016. We want to thank today's audience and the many people who have joined us at more than 60 panel discussions, full-day conferences, expert roundtables, and press backgrounders that we've conducted over the course of this year. We'll be back in 2017, we hope. Please visit our website at mei.edu to stay informed on upcoming events. Today we're going to hear first from Jim Zobey, who is, as we said, the co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute and managing director of Zobey Research Services. Jim led an effort again this year to examine public opinion across 8 Middle Eastern states, a research task unique in its scope and rigor. He'll speak about the aims and methodology of the poll and provide highlights from his findings and interpretation. His published report is available on request. After Jim's presentation, it will be my honor to moderate a discussion about the poll results with Jim and our other expert panelists. And we're delighted that we were able to put together a very strong group, I hope a very informative group of panelists who will be able to discuss the report. We have with us today Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Ellen Leifson, who is the Distinguished Fellow and President Emeritus at the Stimson Center, and Hassan Nemna, who is a scholar with us at the Middle East Institute and a regular contributor to Al Hayat and the online outlets Middle East Alternatives and Fikra Forum. Their bios are in the flyer that you picked up as you came in, and we're delighted that they're able to join us today. Our event today is also being live streamed by AAI and recorded for posting on the MEI website in both video and podcast form. So we ask that you silence your mobile devices and also that you sit up straight in your chairs because you may be on camera. With that, I want to thank you again for coming today, for braving the elements, and ask that you welcome Jim Zobey.
Thank you, and I want to thank the Middle East Institute for being a partner with us in the last several years in releasing this annual survey. We do a lot of polling across the Middle East. I'm actually on my way on Sunday in Abu Dhabi to present the findings of a 10-nation survey on religious behavior and attitudes. We do quality of life surveys, we do government performance satisfaction with government performance surveys, we do a range of them. This is always the most interesting and in some ways the most challenging annual survey that we do though. And it is because it's for an annual conference that takes place in the UAE that is co-sponsored by the UAE and CSIS here in town. And so the sort of mix of questions are designed by a board of people to reflect the panel discussions that take place at the conference. And so it is a survey that is not around a single topic, but about a range of topics. And Stephen was this year at the conference and got a sense of the kind of the breadth of the discussion. It's really quite fascinating to hear folks in the region debate all of these various topics. Every year we have some consistent parts to the panel and to the survey instrument, and then we have others that change depending upon the issues that the folks there want to discuss. Let me begin with the first part, which is an effort to look at favorable and unfavorable ratings of countries and how people in the region view these countries. The countries that we surveyed, incidentally, are Egypt, UAE, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, UAE, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran. And Saudi Arabia, a kind of a healthy range of 6 Arab countries and then Turkey and Iran. We asked them favorable, unfavorable. We asked them whether or not they feel each of these countries contributes to peace and stability in the region. And we asked them whether or not they feel relations with that country are important for their country, to get a sense of where people's attitudes are. Let me start with Saudi Arabia, which was one of the surprises in this year's survey, because in every country other than Lebanon, Saudi Arabia's ratings went up. And Jordan slightly down, but in every other one up. And Lebanon went from a very high number only down to 57 favorable rating, which is really quite significant. For years prior to this, Lebanon's numbers had always, attitude for Saudi Arabia had always been very low. But Saudi Arabia's initial spike was their big support for the Lebanese military. They pulled out of that. It dropped, but you still see them at a fairly high number. With Jordan at 85 and Egypt at 84 and Turkey at 83 being the highest. Even with Iran, a 36% favorable rating, and every country, majorities said that including Iran, said that good relations with Saudi Arabia was important for their country. Iran is a different story. Iran, which in our polling, you may have come to our event at the Wilson Center years ago when I released a book called Looking at Iran. The numbers for Iran from 2006 up to 2012, up to 2008 and 9 had been very high. And then in 2012, we began to notice a precipitous drop. Everywhere but in Lebanon. Lebanon stayed high for a bit, but the number of Iran's ratings dropped almost every year and rather consistently. Interestingly enough, the Lebanon numbers, favorable rating for Iran, which had always been high, are now lower than the favorable ratings for Saudi Arabia, which is kind of unique, something that we hadn't experienced before. And then the final one in this set that I'll present, I'll go back to the beginning one, that's where it is Turkey, which had also had a spike in numbers. Turkey was playing a different role in the region, and people were growing increasingly appreciative of Turkey's role. But in 2016, we find Turkey's numbers dropping in every single country. I would make a couple of additional adds here before I go on to the next one. I didn't do a graph on the U.S. because the numbers are all over the place. But what's interesting is that an observation that we made back in 2013 was that the U.S. numbers were inching upward the lower the U.S. footprint in the region. While Arab leaders might complain that the U.S. isn't doing enough, Arab people feel the less you do, the more they get to focus on the other aspects of America that they like. Quality of life and science and technology and issues that when, the old line, they hate us for our values, they actually, when we poll, they like our values. They just don't like the way we apply our values in the region. But the less we do, the better off it appears that our ratings are. There are some policy issues that play, and so what we found with the U.S. this year was that numbers went up rather significantly in some countries. In Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan, numbers went up, but in Saudi Arabia and Turkey, they went down. And I think that I mean, we didn't ask the why questions, but I would assume that the why questions have more to do with in Saudi Arabia and in Turkey with Syria policy and dissatisfaction for that. In Saudi Arabia, the numbers went from a 62 high favorable rating last year to 28, and in Turkey from 33 to 21. But that 28 is still significantly higher than it was when George Bush left office, and the Obama spike went up. It went up with his term beginning, went down rather precipitously in the first 4 or 5 years, but has begun to edge up. So even that 28 in Saudi Arabia is a fairly good number. I would also say about the U.S. that on the question of are relations important, is it important for your country to have relations with the U.S. In every country, the numbers of those who said yes were 20 points or more higher than those who had a favorable rating. So the role of the U.S. is greatly appreciated, even if there might be a sense of we're not happy with the country and what the country is doing. I didn't also mention Iran in here, and I'm sorry, Russia. Russia did not fare well in any country except for Iran. It was the only country that gave it a favorable rating. And in most of the Arab countries, its rating was negative, and relations with the country were also viewed as not important. We included Israel. You can get the book out front when you leave. The favorable rating was 0 in almost every country. Is it important to have relations with them? 0. I think while there are those here who say it's possible to have strong relations between Israel and the Gulf countries and Arab countries in this new era of confronting Iran, and Secretary Kerry poured cold water on that the other day, saying that until the Arab-Israeli conflict is solved, don't count on it, guys. From the numbers we're seeing, I think Kerry was right. Arab leaders it would be a risky move at this point to fail to recognize how decidedly unfavorable attitudes are toward Israel. Let's look at the obstacles to peace and stability in the region. This was interesting. When we first were framing the question, it was, do you include occupation of Palestine in there? Will it skew all the numbers? I decided that you had to put it in there because it's an issue. But it turns out that it's only an issue when you ask what is the most serious obstacle to peace and stability in the region. It's only an issue in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, where it was about 40% overall. It would have given that when asked to define the two most. So overall, maybe about a quarter of the population would say that. Even split between external threats being the obstacles to peace and stability, Iran, too little U.S. leadership, too much U.S. interference, or occupation of Palestine, and the other half being internal threats, which are domestic rivalries, sectarian, regional rivalries, tribal rivalries, and the lack of representative government. Now pay attention to that last one, the lack of representative government, and look at this one. In the other countries we surveyed, almost 2 to 1, internal factors doubled external factors when asked what's the most serious obstacle to peace and stability. Name 2. With lack of representative government being simply the largest factor there. You can't see the difference between the blue and the almost black for occupation of Palestine. This was surprising to me because in Jordan, occupation of Palestine was listed as 1 or 2%. Now that doesn't mean it's not an important issue. It just means that when looking at the broad range of what's the most serious threats to peace and stability, that wasn't there. The issues of internal factors facing each of these countries by 2-to-1 outweighed every other concern. Going on to the next one. Device. Oops. We asked a series of questions about Iraq and Syria to find out what were the problems that people thought were bringing people to both of those countries to fight as part of terrorist organizations, ISIS or Al-Qaeda. You'll see the numbers. It's a fairly complex map that gets created, but overall, what we found was that a lack of representative government, a lack of a government that actually worked to represent all the segments of the society was identified as the single most important problem. And so when we asked what's the most important step to take to stop the flow of young people, look at reform the government and where it is as number 1 or number 2, higher than almost any other overall issue in the survey. And you'll see that it's the same when we talk about Syria. Oops. All right, you told me this was going to sit, and it does. All right, let's go back. Where's the... Should I get a memo? No. Yeah, why don't you do it manually? Help me out here. It's skipping over Syria. Okay, I want to go next one. You're having no better luck than there's one in between those. Let me just tell you. What you're going to find is that in both Iraq and in Syria, the biggest issues were lack of representative government. And the solutions, therefore, were solutions that involved creating more representative government. In Syria, what was interesting was that overall, in most of the countries, the solution was a solution without Bashar al-Assad. And only in Iran was a solution with Bashar al-Assad, one of the top two issues. Let's go on to let's just skip over that. We're not doing well at it. Okay. Next, we asked questions about threats of how confident people were in agencies of their own government dealing with political threats. And what you find is that overall there's satisfaction in most countries except Iraq. Now I would tell you that the middle stripe is somewhat confident. That's not a ringing endorsement exactly. So that the countries where actually you see real endorsement, real support, UAE was basically the one where people were most confident. Saudi Arabia and Jordan also confident. But in most of the other countries, it was either somewhat confident or not confident at all on those two, on police and intelligence agencies and political leadership. And then where, again, in terms of religious leadership and the role they play in confronting the threat of violent extremist groups, again, only Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and UAE scoring well, and others not so well. And on the role of the non-government, pretty much everyone scores lukewarm, or in Egypt in particular, quite poorly. Let me go to the next set. I think if I could say that what to me was the most important finding here was some of the polling we did in Iran itself. We asked questions, as we always do, about priorities. And we asked about government performance. I stacked up the 2015 numbers about what were the priorities you wanted the government to meet with the 2016 numbers of satisfaction with government performance. you find an Iranian public that is not satisfied with government performance. A drop of 30 points on the issue of the economy. People had high expectations after the after the Iran deal. We asked that question after the Iran deal, what do you think in the wake of this deal are the most important priorities for the government to pursue? And these are what they told us: investing in the economy, advancing democracy and protecting personal and civil rights, improving relations with Arab countries and with the West. Not so important was giving greater support to our allies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Only 48% said that. But if you ask them in 2016, how well has the government done on these priorities, only 51% are satisfied with the economy performance, 30% with protecting civil and political rights, 35% improving relations with the Arab governments, and for all the ballyhoo here in America about how we've tipped toward Iran and Iran is getting everything from us and we're betraying all of our traditional allies, only 15% of Iranians are satisfied that the U.S. and Iranian relations have actually improved and gotten better in that time. And now, with regard to the last one, this to me was the most striking. The importance of Iran's involvement in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. In 2014, 90% of Iranians said it was important for Iran to be involved in Syria. 87% said Iraq. 88% said Lebanon, and only 62%, but still high, Yemen. Look at the precipitous decline from year to year. And today, Iranians, only 24% think it's important for their country to be involved in Syria.
Wow.
Only 47% say in Iraq, 43% in Lebanon, 41% in Iraq, 43% in Lebanon, and 39%, still a surprisingly high 39% in Yemen. But that drop in Syria says to me that Iranians are not finding it worth the investment, especially when their expectations were that there was going to be an improvement, greater improvement in the economy, greater improvement in political and civil rights. That didn't happen. Instead, their country is involved in foreign ventures, not unlike situations we found here at home and in other countries in the region. But it was surprising to me that Iranians were as forthcoming in telling us about that. One last finding that is not made in the form of a PowerPoint. When we asked how to stop extremist recruiting overall, there was a near consensus in all the countries that it was necessary to change the political and social circumstances that led some people to become attracted to extremist ideas. Again, I thought a very insightful view of the internal factors and the contribution that they play in creating both government instability but also recruitment for incitement. Again, the report is available outside when you leave, as is the 2015 report, and if you want to find it online, it's at www.zogbyresearchservices.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for a very cogent and insightful presentation on the findings of your surveys. And if I can begin with you, and let me just ask this question since it's all about us always. In terms of where the U.S. stands, as you noted, and you had at the MEI conference last month, you had made the point also that in fact the relatively constrained U.S. engagement with the region has contributed to people perhaps feeling a little bit more positively about the United States or focusing on other things. Two questions come up in my mind. One is there a direct correlation? In other words, if we continue to retreat from the region, do our poll numbers continue to go up? So that if we go, it's the old question about taxes. If you reduce taxes to zero, does that mean that the economy grows at 50% a year? If we reduce our engagement to zero, does that mean that our popularity continues to go up? And secondly, I think it is significant about Saudi Arabia, and at a time where, in fact, our engagement with the Saudis in soft power ways, and we have 35,000 Saudi students here in the United States. We have a level of engagement on non-energy, non-security related issues with the Saudis more than we have at any point in the past. And yet our numbers have gone down precipitously, not matched, for example, by the UAE, which you would think would have the same kind of popular views on the United States as the Saudis do. So to what do you attribute that?
Let me start with the first. I would say when we look at the numbers of America, America's standing in the region, we have to see them against decades of, in other words, if I look at the low numbers, I'll say we worked really hard to get those low numbers. Like Congress and its 9% approval rating, they earn it every day. In the book I wrote called Arab Voices, I dealt with a lot of that. Why are the attitudes as negative as they are? And it's largely because Arabs say, we like your values, but we don't think you apply your values to us. We feel like jilted lovers. We love you, but we feel you simply don't love us. And when you see the importance of issues that people in the region rank as important issues in the past, our behavior with Israel, our behavior with in Iraq over just the period of the last 16, actually 20 years, during the sanctions period, etc. Things like that accumulate. And so the less we do, when people say more military involvement in Syria, they look at that and they say, we've already seen what you do and how badly you do it. Please spare us that. When we did the poll in 2013 and we asked a series of questions about Syria, the last thing they wanted us to do was get militarily involved. The thing they wanted from us was more humanitarian assistance, more effort at achieving a negotiated settlement. Those are the things they think we might do well, but what we don't do well is militarily engage. That's a two-sided coin. In some countries that will play out well, but in some other countries, Turkey and Saudi Arabia in particular, that doesn't play out well. And so, will it improve our standing everywhere if we were to totally disengage? We would still remain in many. The country where streets are paved in gold, where there's great opportunity. The values, when we poll on America, we ask all of the various questions about America. How do you feel about American cinema? How do you feel about American product? How do you feel about American values, etc.? They love all that. But when they make the judgment how they feel about America, it's not based on the values, it's based on the policies. It's a policy-driven negative value. That's what, no pun intended, what trumps all of the other things. Now, the less we do, the more people can focus on the positive values and contributions we make to society, and the fact they want their kids to get educated here, and the fact that they can come here and shop and find freedom, how to operate on the streets, etc. That's what ultimately then weighs. So the less we do, yes, it will improve, but with some diminishing returns in some countries where, in fact, more is expected of us. And so there has to be more of a balance there. Now, on the second question, which was on the Saudis. The Saudis. Look, the JESTA took a toll. And it reinforced a whole lot of negative ideas that are going on in the kingdom. Actually, this poll was being done during the JESTA debate. And there is a sense that America has let them down. We look at our support for them with Yemen as we're paying our dues. They're not happy with that. And they're not happy with the fact that too many other things. Now, I guess I also have to say that I think the narrative that has developed about our tilt toward Iran, the narrative that developed our tilt toward the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the fact that there was a sense that Obama just didn't like them. All of that played out, and the president didn't help himself in with the Jeffrey Goldberg article, which got played very large in that region, about when the president is quoted saying something like, not that complicated. When he's talking about Southeast Asia, young people there are entrepreneurial and they're trying to build a better future. Unlike, he makes the contrast with the Gulf, where he said all they do is want to murder and hate. And it was a kind of a Golda Meir-ish quote, which was just really unfortunate for his legacy in that region. So I think a lot of things have contributed to this. So I wasn't as surprised by the Saudi numbers as I was surprised by the favorable numbers in some other countries.
Right. And that might also account for why there would be a distinction between the Saudi citizens and Emirati citizens, that some of these numbers reflect Saudi specific.
Very Saudi specific. I mean, the Emirates may pursue similar policies,
Right.
but they have, number one, thicker skin, and number two, they're immune from some of that because they simply operate below the radar. You have to look far and wide to find stories that include UAE in the mix when they're writing about, this or that. Gulf Coalition partners, they'll talk about, but UAE doesn't get mentioned, and so there's a sense that they've kind of been able to keep distance from a lot of this, and I think that's fair to say.
Well, Alan, if I can ask you to follow up on one of the points that Jim made, and part of this last issue, and that was that because the United States and the role of the United States has been reduced a little bit, is not as much front and center with populations in the region, that it has allowed other issues to emerge as primary drivers for their attitudes about Syria, about Iraq, about some of the other things going on, and specifically this issue, as Jim's poll demonstrates, of the high priority that people are putting on governmental reform, issues of representation, economic inequality. And is this, in your view, kind of an aftershock from the Arab Spring? Is this something that really is portending a major change in the way populations in the region see their priorities and where they should focus their attention?
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks to Jim for giving us such compelling and, fresh information about the mood in some of the key countries of the Middle East. So let me take two pieces to Jerry's question. First is, I don't think of it as a negative interaction of the Arab Spring. I think that it suggests that the Arab Spring isn't over, that there's an enduring debate going on in the Arab world about that individual citizens are thinking about their relationship to their government in different ways. It doesn't mean that we're going back to Tahrir Square and the sort of heady days of the early Arab Spring, but it means this question of we're not sure our government is doing all it should to serve our interests is still out there. That's a big idea, and that's not about the United States unless you want to say, conceptually it's somehow connected to the values that the United States promotes in the world. But I thought it was really striking. My favorite graph of the whole thing, when you all get the hard copy, is the rank order of obstacles to peace and stability in the region, and that all 7 of the Arab countries plus Turkey, not Iran, but the Arab countries plus Turkey, put no representative government as either their first or second obstacle. So they are talking about themselves. They're focused on their own institutions, their own government, and that there are 2 thoughts about the U.S., and I'm always amused that, we chronically have this Goldilocks problem, that the porridge is either too hot or it's too cold. All of the issues about too much American interference or too little American leadership are way at the bottom of those lists, that in every country they're either, topic 6, 7, or 8. So that there's no representative government as issue number 1 or 2 suggests to me that there's an enduring demand for change in Arab societies, and that's an impressive finding, I think. It demonstrates a desire for a more enlightened government in the region, and I think that's something that the U.S. should care about. I think we understand that the new American administration may not want to even touch democracy promotion, and certainly there's a backlash against having the United States be the agent of change. So what we are talking about is a long process of change from within. And I thought that was really kind of a moving finding that the polling did.
Can I ask you, though, it struck me as quite interesting that on the one hand, as you said, most of the people in these countries identified issues related to representative government, economic reform, some of these other issues as what they consider to be primary obstacles to peace and stability in the region. And yet, at the same time, when people were asked about their trust in the institutions of their societies, both governmental, security, religious, private sector, business communities, they expressed a certain amount, either somewhat or very confident in the ability of those institutions to perform in defeating some of the extremism.
Right.
Is that a contradiction?
I don't think so at all. I think that if you see a very tough approach to combating extremism, I think that people recognize that you've got to deal with the extremism to get on to a more enlightened agenda, if you will. So I think they do want a strong state to get rid of the bad guys, but then their long-term demand of what, the 96% of the population, the 99% of the population want would be more representative government. But it is true that they seem to support very tough measures to deal with extremism.
Let me just add one thing. The 2013 poll that we did, that I made reference to, was 5 years after Cairo, is what we called it. It's available also on the website. I thought that the most...
By Cairo, you mean
the Cairo speech, right.
Yeah.
It was, in this poll was all about the United States. It was interesting because I thought the president's most impressive speech was not the Cairo speech, but it was the second anniversary of the Cairo speech, when he talked about the fact that we didn't start Arab Spring, we couldn't direct it, and we couldn't determine its outcome. But what we could do was help with the building blocks of creating a middle class and the sort of the institutions that would help democracy. The problem is that we've focused, and so he talked about job creation, he talked about healthcare, he talked about improving educational systems. And I looked at the person sitting next to me at the speech and I said, this is not a speech to the Arabs, this is a speech to Congress, to step up and do their job. Of course they didn't. But what was I think interesting in that poll was when we asked people, what do you want from the United States? They wanted investment in jobs. They know what we do well. What they don't want from us is meddling in their internal politics, like we would not have wanted Sweden helping us with our healthcare system, or we wouldn't want Britain. No, I mean, that people don't like other countries interfering with their internal stuff, but they do know what other countries do well, and what America does well is we create jobs. We can invest in technology. We can help build educational systems and stuff. That's the thing that they want from us. And so when we ask them about Syria or Iraq, do you want the U.S. to do more? The answer is no, they don't. But they know what we can do, and that is take care of refugees, provide humanitarian assistance, and push for reforms, and push for, rather, diplomatic solutions. That's the stuff we do and can do. That's the stuff we don't spend enough time on. Instead, we focus on the other stuff.
Which is an important point, and I want to ask Steve to follow up on this. You have, aside from the United States, you have three, and aside from the Israelis as well, you have three non-Arab countries that are being ranked, rated in this survey. You have the Russians, you have the Turks, and you have the Iranians. All of them saw sometimes fairly dramatic drops in Arab attitudes about them. And is that a reflection of the point that Jim is making about us, which is that people are responding negatively to what they see as greater intervention, greater involvement in Arab issues?
In short, yes. But before I get into that a little bit, I just want to add my 2 cents to what Ellen and Jim have been saying, which is to suggest, I think, that the idea, and let me disagree with you ever so slightly on it, that the idea that Arabs are, as a result of what happened in 2010 and 2011, suddenly interested in representative government, and that somehow it changed, and that the Arab Spring, a term I absolutely hate, but it's not as bad as the Arab Awakening, that somehow this is ignited a debate about representative government, when in fact, historically, Arabs have long debated and talked about in a rather more ideologically rich political environment than we often think of. And one of the demands that, at least in Egypt, one of my favorite countries besides my own, that has run through almost 150 years of history, has been a demand for representative government. So what we're seeing, actually, through these kind of momentous events of the last 5 years, is a sort of consistency about what Arabs think are wrong with their own societies, and it goes to questions about who they are and what kind of societies they want to live in. And I think consistently they've said over and over again, in a variety of different ways, we want more representative government. Now, Jared, to your question specifically, I think it's self-evident that that as the Iranians and the Russians cooperate and collaborate in the slaughter of Syrians, that has had a profound impact on the standing of those two countries in the region. Forgetting the fact that there's some romance among some governments in the region and the Russians, certainly not between the Iranians and some governments in the region. But nevertheless, I think it's clear to many, many people in the region that is a problem with the Iranians and the Russians. And it's quite a change, actually. I remember arriving in Cairo in the fall of 2006, and the Iranians were quite popular because of what had just happened in Lebanon. Now, on Turkey, it's a little more complicated. Certainly, there are, in places like Egypt and other places, there are extenuating circumstances to the dramatic decline in Turkey's standing. It does include Syria. You hear Egyptians saying the Turks have a lot to answer for in Syria. There is a general sense that the Turks have flirted with and to some extent collaborated with extremist groups as an extension of Turkish power. It has made the situation in Syria worse. But in Turkey, also in many of these places, is that we, in 2010, 2011, 2012, talked about a Turkish model, and there actually was some truth to that. There were young Arabs across the political spectrum that were fascinated by what was happening in Turkey. Turkey seemed to have resolved the problem of the accumulation of Islamist political power, prosperity, and democratic change since arguably 2013, but even prior to that, if you're paying a lot of attention to Turkey, there has been a reversal of at least the democratic changes, and that since 2013, the Turkish leadership has demonstrated themselves to be really using the same kinds of tactics that more recently deposed Arab leaders had used against their own populations, so that Turkey's no longer a model of prosperity and democratization and political pluralism that some believed it would be at that time.
That's good. So we can say that perhaps this is the Erdogan effect.
There certainly is an Erdogan effect on a variety of different levels, yes.
Right.
Let me just say, we did a poll maybe 5 years ago about non-Arab countries' views of Arabs, non-Arab Muslim countries' views of Arabs. Turkey was fascinated, and Iran was fascinated. The two of them were, both had negative attitudes towards Arabs, rather significant, very sense of superiority, their own cultural superiority and institutional superiority. Turkey was interesting because we asked one question of all of the countries, which is, do you feel that one country should lead Islam or should all countries be equal in Islam? The only country where a majority said that one country should lead was Turkey. And when we asked the follow-up question, which country should lead, the 80% said that Turkey should lead, that one country should lead, 100% of them said it should be Turkey. But we asked them all these questions about Arabs, and then we said, have you been to the Arab world? And what countries have you been to? 7% of Turks had been to an Arab country, despite the proximity. I said to myself when I finished this poll, they're in trouble, because they're deeply engaging at the time in the Arab world, and they know less about it in some ways than Americans do, and have the same sense of cultural superiority. They're going to step in it and get themselves in trouble. When we reversed the poll and asked Arabs what they thought about Turkey, they had not been to Turkey either, but they had an impression of Turkey that they got from television. It's a great country, big buildings, a lot of lush green, whatever, etc. That image, and I think Stephen is absolutely right, that image that was created in media of a functioning democracy, a prosperous society, has come crashing down since the behaviors of the government, and I think it's taken a toll.
Yeah. Although I would say, I mean, my own experience is that I was in Pakistan at the, kind of the apogee of Turkish popularity in the Turkish model, and the Pakistanis certainly looked at Turkey that way. And of course, there's a long history between those two countries that's interesting, and that might help explain why Pakistanis would have that favorable view. But I never thought that the countries of the old Ottoman Empire were as positive about Turkey as those who had never been exposed to the Turkish governments. Hassan, can you talk a little bit about of course, to a certain extent, I mean, this poll, like all polls, is a snapshot of a particular moment in time. I think that to a certain extent, there is a predictive power to polling. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you see, this polling and the conclusions that we've been drawing here, helping to steer us forward on policy issues.
Absolutely. First of all, clearly, evidently, the amount of work that has been done into this project is tremendous, and upon reading it, I kept on trying to see how can I extract benefit from it. I mean, I have to start by saying that clearly it has not been a good year for pollsters, and it has led actually to the point of questioning methodology, but also questioning the power of numbers and how numbers can be read one way or another. Let me start by a few questions about this poll, and then I'll offer, in the form of a provocative suggestion, a couple of remarks. The questions, I'd like to point to two anomalies. One we've already addressed, actually. The fact that indeed reform and an apparent dissatisfaction with the government seems to be at the top of the list of elements, of factors that do not favor peace and stability in the region. But it does not correlate with the other results of satisfaction with the performance of government and security and military institutions. So I know we have ways to explain it, but in my mind this is anomaly number one that we ought to address. Anomaly number two, which is even more acute, and actually I would place it number one in terms of its acuteness, is Israel. Here we have a consistent zero for Israel throughout, and as Jim actually has suggested, that should take away the proposition that any kind of rapprochement can happen with Israel up until the Palestinian question is resolved. But the Palestinian question is not at the top of the concerns, and actually it is rather it figures very marginal in more than one context. Let me step out of the project here, the survey, the poll, and point to the fact that while I was reading the list of all the number of issues that have been listed, and ranked in order. I was trying very idiosyncratically, because after all, I'm not a polling institution, I'm just a person, but who's trying to remain acquainted, whether through social media, through the press, through following narratives in the region, trying to make a correlation between these topics and what I see empirically. And I have to say very little. Along the lines that when I look at what are the concerns in particular in social media, but even beyond, meaning at the level of political discourse, these are not the issues. So here I go back to the question, and now I'm stepping into the methodological. Methodological, but also in terms of presentation. The report talks about let's say, whether the Iranians or the Jordanians cited X as being the reason number one. Actually, a more accurate way of looking at it, and the report actually makes it clear in other parts, is they chose out of a list of 10 options presented to them, they chose item X as number one. It does not mean that if they were to be asked, please list, without any elements, without any factors being given to them, list the 10 factors that matter to you, that we would have had a comparable mapping. And I think this is a problem to polling in general, to this poll in particular, because this is what we're concerned with, but it leads me to the following. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm trying to find ways of looking constructively and extracting information of this poll, and I know the following. First of all, from my own assessment of the general attitude of your typical Arab citizen, if such an entity exists, because clearly it does not. It varies from country, from state to state. It varies from setting to setting. It varies from circumstances to circumstances. Nonetheless, I would say, if I were to make a crude generalization, I would argue the concerns are local. The concerns with regard to government are clientelistic, along the lines I need services from government. And the concerns with regard to the region are influenced very much so by a passion that is driven by two competing narratives in the region. So, to a large extent, what the way I was able to derive benefit out of this report is by considering it to be a measure of which one of the two competing political narratives has made more, if you like, breakthrough into the popular, into general, if you like, positions, up to the point where certain positions were selected. And the two, without really going into extreme detail, one is solidly pro-Saudi, the other is solidly pro-Iranian, or I should say one is anti-Saudi, the other is anti-Iranian. One tries to appeal to a Sunni passion in particular, the other tries to appeal to a minority passion in particular. I'm very much so schematizing here, but I'm just putting them on this way. So why would Israel get zero throughout? Because here we get into another aspect of these two narratives. The Arabic language is diglossic, which means there is one way of speaking formally and one way of speaking in a familiar way. I would argue that political language, political discourse in the Middle East is also diglossic. Part of the diglossia in Arabic political discourse at the two levels is that Israel has to be ranked as zero, irrespective of how you feel about it, and therefore you rank it as zero. Now, I do not need to go into extreme detail to tell you that anecdotally, I do not see that zero to be consistently zero at all. I see clearly a lot of anger, especially at settlements, at the mistreatment of Palestinians, but I also see a lot of admiration to democracy, to achievement, to technology, etc. How come it's not reflected at all? I think this raises, if you like, the methodological question about whether we at the end are just testing the validity or the insertion or the success rate of one of the two political narratives, or actually are we really testing public opinion?
Jim?
Let me start by saying it actually wasn't such a bad year for polling. I mean, I think that if you look at it, it was a bad year for pundits who didn't understand how to use the polling period, and who used polling that they shouldn't have used. I mean, the problem was with the state polls, not with the national polls. The state polls were all over the place, because if you looked at them, you had every little school that had 200 students that could make phone calls doing polling. And then you've got bad averages based on bad polls that shouldn't have been done and shouldn't have been reported on. But if you look at the major polling, and look, we don't do domestic polling, and my brother doesn't do it anymore either, but Hillary was about 3 weeks out, she was up by 7 to 10, and then she was up by 4, and then she was up by 3, and by the time you got down to the end, she was up by 1 or 2. Guess what? She won by 1 or 2. She won. Basically, that's what the polls measured. Now, the state-by-state polling was a different story because you had all these little colleges doing it, and people were saying, oh, Monmouth College today reports that, and then all of a sudden everybody's off to the races with, my God, it's a runaway. And frankly, I don't understand what their methodologies were, and when you look at what their methodologies were, you get really scared. It's very different polling here because you can't use a consistent form of, you can't do telephone polling everywhere, you can't use online polling everywhere, you can't, nobody quite knows how to do it here because we're in a different technological era. So overall, though, the national polls, I think, didn't do so badly and shouldn't get a bum rap. But the pundits should be abused for the fact that they blew it, big time. And they blew it with Trump from the very beginning when they were pronouncing him dead before he even took his first breath. And after every debate, oh, he finished himself, he's really done for. And then he'd come up 4 or 5 points. They never quite got the Trump effect at all. Now, number 2. On the reform issues.
Apologies to any pundits in the audience.
Jim also is not going to be the commencement speaker tonight.
No, actually, I don't do those anymore. But thank you if they wanted to offer, I'd come. Look, the reform issues were on the top of the list. And they were on the top of the list because look at the way the question was asked. It wasn't, does your government need reform? It was looking at problem areas in the region. It was looking at Libya, it was looking at Yemen, it was looking at Syria, and it was looking at Iraq. What are the problems there? And the problems there were that non-representative government. And that's what we were interested with. Not what's wrong with your government. We were asking them, why is Syria a problem? And is Syria a problem because of Russia? Is Syria a problem because of Iran? Is Syria a problem because of the United States? And the answer was no. Syria is a problem because of its own internal problem. That itself is instructive. Because the assumption here is that Arabs are blaming everybody else for the problems. And they weren't. They were blaming the fact that Syria was dysfunctional as a state. They're blaming Iraq as being dysfunctional as a state. Yemen dysfunctional as a state. Libya as just being plain dysfunctional. I mean, that's the issue. And I think that that was very instructive. Now, when they then look at dealing with extremism in your own country, what do you think about your government and how it's performing? Well, they gave in the UAE a very solid rating to their government performance. They gave a somewhat favorable rating in other countries. There was a nuance to this. Don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. But what people would say in the Emirates about the performance of their government versus what they'd say about why Iraq, Syria, and Yemen and Libya are imploding, two different things. Don't try to mix them and say, oh, I found a problem. Israel, getting 0. And Palestine not being recorded. We've done so much polling on this issue. And I will tell you that whether it gets a report or not, look, don't dismiss the fact that for Egyptians, 40% said it was the #1 issue. And for Saudis, it's the #1 issue. And if we were to look at that, just in terms of the numerical value of Egyptian Saudis versus the rest of the populations, and Turkey also the #1 issue, that's a lot of opinion. So let's not say that Israel gets a pass on this or that Palestine is being ignored. But number 2, when you're talking to Lebanese, for example, to tell me that they're not concerned about Palestine? No. They just are not right now, at this moment in time, with this snapshot, saying it's the #1 problem for peace and stability in the region, not when they've got fires raging next door. Now, should there be a third intifada, you would get a very different read. I mean, Palestine remains, I call it, it's the wound in the heart that never heals. And the minute it explodes, you find out, I've been doing this work for 40 years now, and I can tell you articles from every major journal, the issue's over, Arabs don't care about Palestine anymore, it's just finished, it's the write it off, and then it explodes and everybody goes, oh my gosh, we didn't quite get that. And they're like the pundits dealing with the presidential contest. and with Trump. The issue is this issue matters, but in this snapshot in several countries, they have bigger fish to fry right now. But don't take that as a pass on Palestine. And thirdly, look, we did an analysis on social media one time. We did an analysis of political discourse and topics raised, etc. That's one way to look at a country, and actually can be useful. Although what we found in Egypt, for example, was quite different than what people expected. They thought when we looked at Arab Spring and social media that we were going to find all the social media because it was the Facebook revolution. And actually, the regime was using Facebook more than the opposition was. The regime was using the various devices of social media more than the others were. So if you did it quantitatively, it came out pretty much a draw. That wasn't the issue. And in the silo that you were in, it looked like that was the universe. If you were in that silo, that was the universe. But when you do polling, you do a different kind of thing. You talk to everybody. And you get a different picture. And yeah, we do forced choice questions. You have to do forced choice questions. Because if you've ever done an open-ended poll, you don't want to be around me when I'm trying to look at that crap and make sense out of it. When you say, what are your top 10 issues? It could be my neighbor next door. I mean, I understand that. I mean, I remember during the start of the Iraq War, how frustrated I was because we were making, we were sending young men and women off to who knew what. And I'd be at the mall and people were just buying ice cream and riding their bikes and whatever. People's daily lives matter and trump all these other issues. But if you then want to know how important issue of these issues, what is the most important, that tells you something. And so I'm not going to throw that out because it didn't include whether my child's football team wins the game on Saturday, or whether or not my father can get sick from his incurable disease, or whether or not my pension is going to enough for me to survive. I can put all those in it too. But I'm doing a forced choice based on some very specific issues, and I'm ranking based on that. Does it tell me something? Sure it does. Should I ignore all those other issues? Absolutely not. But I have to understand that when people are telling me the problem in Syria of all these choices is not too much U.S. involvement, not too little U.S. interference, but the problem is a lack of representative government, that's telling me something. And it's something important that should not be ignored.
Thank you. And Hassan and Jim are going to be appearing on point counterpoint today. We want to go to the audience and give all of you an opportunity to ask a question. But before we do that, last question to Ellen. The one country in this polling that was asked, where people were asked specifically, what is your attitude towards your government, was Iran. And the answers, I think, were extremely interesting, as Jim kind of laid out in his presentation. One that you would interpret from the final slide, that Iranians do not want to go abroad looking for monsters. And specifically, I wonder whether the precipitous drop in popular support in Iran for the Syrian intervention isn't a direct attribute of the number of Iranian casualties that they're suffering there. And then the other part, I would think that if I were Rouhani, I'd be a little bit concerned about the low level of satisfaction with the performance of his government. So the question is, what is your view, and how do you think that is going to color Iranian policy and the elections that are coming up?
Great, thanks Jerry, and thanks for giving me a chance to go back now and revise a little bit what I said about the focus on non-representative government. Jim has clarified that they were really commenting on the region and the countries that are in great turmoil, not necessarily about themselves. When it comes to Iran talking about their own government, I think you've already put your finger on it, that in the case of Syria, clearly the reports of casualties, they have now stopped denying. There are public funerals. It's over, I believe, 1,000 to 2,000 dead and at least 6,000 to 7,000 wounded coming back from the Syrian conflict. Josh Landis gave a talk at the Wilson Center yesterday, and one of the really interesting things that he said that would validate this is that Iran is also not doing that well on promoting its soft power in Syria. So the Iranians are building Shia mosques, and the Alawites don't want to go to the Iranian mosques. So that even if we think long-term about Iran's influence and impact on Syria in the long run, there's a mantra out there that Iran owns these capitals and that somehow Iran is riding high. And I think we need a slightly more differentiated analysis that Iran is hitting some roadblocks and obstacles in promoting its own policies in the region. So, but I don't assume that it's going to make a big difference in the elections next year. I mean, I think that there's still a dominant power structure in Iran. If the supreme leader and his entourage don't want Rouhani to win, there will be some manipulation, either in terms of who's eligible to run, or, which is already happening, so we don't know. I mean, there is a worry, I think, in the camp that negotiated the nuclear agreement with Iran, that of course very much wants to see Rouhani and Zarif survive, so that the camp that is deeply committed to the successful implementation of that agreement remain in place. But I think there is some level of uncertainty. Some Iran political observers are saying, oh no, Rouhani's still strong and the odds are that he would win. But given the change on our side, the Supreme Leader's comments about maybe there's a real erosion of the assumptions that the Iranians were making about the value of the nuclear agreement and the value of are they benefiting enough from the lifting of sanctions, etc., we could see a mood shift in Iran that becomes more defiant, or that is simply directed from the top against the more liberal forces in the country.
I'd say, looking at the numbers, that there's a space for an Iranian Bernie.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
But
so we'll make that recommendation to it. Great, and with that, and thank you to the panelists, and let us take some questions. We have about 25 minutes left. So this gentleman back here with the blue sweater, yeah, you. No, you.
Microphone.
Yeah. Let us, if you could, short questions and try to get as many as we can.
Yeah, I'm Nama Abdullah with the Uta news agency from Pakistan. I have one question for Mr. Jofi. When you look at the U.S. favorable rating in Iraq, for example, or throughout the Middle East, did you look at it? Can you find answers based on communities? For example, can you know if the U.S. favorable rating was higher in Kurdistan compared to the rest of Iraq, or whether it was higher among the Shias compared to the Sunnis? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's an interesting issue that I think I didn't mention, but warrants observation. The U.S. favorable rating was 6 in Iraq. The U.S. favorable rating was 6 in Iraq, and that is not significantly better than it was. It was 13 in 2012 and 9 in 2015. When numbers are that low, you're not going to find great variability among them, among the different segments of the country. What was interesting, though, was this issue of representative government. We did, I didn't report on it in my presentation, but we did actually ask Iraq the question about what are the problems in Iraq. We asked all the other countries as well as Iraq, and there was it was quite interesting how Iraqis looked at their own country by. There were differences amongst. The Shia said the failure of other governments to press for changes was the problem, and outrage at the sectarian policies of the government were the problem. And Sunni pretty much said the same. Both Sunni and Shia both agreed that the government was too sectarian and was not including representing all segments of society. There were only slight differences between the Arab and Kurdish respondents. And this corresponds to findings that we had last year on Iraq when we asked whether or not they thought the country should be partitioned or the country should be unified. Kurds and Arabs, Sunni and Shia all agreed they wanted a more unified country. And so I think that there's less difference among Iraqis from different segments of the society than there is among the leadership of the various component groups who seem to be driving the division more than the division coming from the bottom up.
Okay. Madam? In the red sweater.
I'm June Rogel with New Israel Funds International Council. Concerning Israel, we know that there's been increased cooperation between Israel and a number of players, a number of the countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, among others. And in large part because Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, has been taking a lead role in speaking out against Iran and the Iranian nuclear deal. Is that something that the countries, the leaders of those Arab countries are so quiet about, not willing to really publicly share that with anyone in their population, that would not affect the zero rating that you got in terms of favorability? I'm just wondering if any of that information is shared with people that you would have polled.
You know, I don't know. I don't know. I assume that they pick it up because they're consumers of media all over the place. There are denials by the governments, and I frankly don't know. I don't have any direct information that Israel and Arab countries are cooperating, and I don't know what they're cooperating on if they were cooperating in any case. You know, what I do read is a former Saudi general going to Israel for something, or the UAE, which hosts the International Renewable Energy, has provided a space for Israel because that was part of the agreement to get the office in the first place. And so there's an Israeli who will come to conferences in the UAE. Does that indicate cooperation or deep strategy? I don't know. But what I do know is what Secretary Kerry said, and that is that don't expect anything public until this issue is solved. And what Rob Malley said a couple of years back, a year ago, and what General Mattis said recently, is that there's nothing that inhibits the U.S. relationship with these countries in a fuller, more robust way than the fact that this issue is not solved and it stands in the way of our partnership on a public level. Wouldn't that be fair?
I think absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's go to the back, the gentleman in the back.
Hello, good afternoon. When you do studies, that means engaging, you're trying to engage and understand other people and the situation. But when in the campaign of Mr. President-elect Trump, he says, Islam gave us, and he praised Saddam Hussein as a man who knows how to kill terrorists, which suggests that he might be a friend with al-Sisi in Egypt and also Assad. Does the U.S. think that controlling the hundreds of millions through dictatorship would be the way forward into dealing with the population? In your polling, do you think the population still aspire for a new uprising? Me personally, I think it will.
Thanks. I'm not sure that everybody could hear your question, but as I understood it, you were asking whether the new the Trump administration believes or will believe that authoritarian government is going to be successful in managing populations in their countries. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does anyone want to take that one on?
Sure, why not? It seems to me, first, that when you use the term the United States controlling, it strikes me that that's a vast overstatement of our capabilities in the Middle East, which we've demonstrated over and over and over again for at least the last 20 years. So it seems to me that what the United States has done, which is what it always does, which is accommodate itself to outcomes that people in the Middle East produce themselves. When you think about Egypt, it probably was not, in fact, I'm pretty confident to say it was not the preference of the United States for a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi, to be elected president in June 2012. But once he was, which was an outcome that Egyptians made, the United States moved to accommodate him. It probably was not the United States' preference for him then to be removed by office via a coup d'etat a year or so later, but nevertheless, the United States accommodated itself to it. I think, though, to get to the heart of your question, which is, do we think that we should be promoting change and reform in the region? It strikes me that there's a tremendous amount of resistance to it, and I think the polling would suggest that. That what people in the Middle East want from the United States are things that we do well, technical assistance, and that we should get back to those basics rather than a kind of broad international social engineering project that has all kinds of unintended consequences that can hurt people in the region as well as Americans. And I think, I have no idea what the Trump administration is going to do, although it seems that their tendency is to look towards authoritarians as a means of political control because their sole interest is in fighting extremism. Now, we should fight extremism, but we probably should have a more nuanced approach to it than just bombing the expletive out of them, as the president-elect said during the long campaign. But nevertheless, I don't expect that we'll be engaged in some sort of broad rethink and then, redo of the Bush administration's freedom agenda.
Yeah, I think that's right. If I could just add to that, I think your comments are exactly correct. And the one thing that occurs to me, I mean, you have an administration that has, or an incoming administration that has spoken about these issues from time to time and has articulated a certain viewpoint on it. But I think that the key point is yours, and that is that these issues are less about U.S. policy and U.S. preferences than they are about managing issues when they emerge. And the question for the administration, which it has not been asked to answer yet, is when you have a person that you're comfortable working with sitting in the presidential palace, but suddenly there are 5 million people in the street demanding that that person goes, what do you do? And which side do you come down? And I think that's a very different kind of a question, a very different kind of a challenge than saying in a theoretical way, if you have an apple and an orange, which one do you prefer?
Let me just respond very quickly to it. I know we're coming down towards the end here. I think that speaks specifically to some of the dangers that the incoming administration will confront because of that narrative that the United States chose to remove its support for President Mubarak at that moment. Anybody who was in Tahrir Square within the first few days of the uprising understood that his rule was coming to an end. There really was no choice that the United States had made. But I think you're right, Jerry, that this is, I think, something, given at least the patchwork of statements that we have from the incoming administration, is something that they're wholly unprepared, and that they may, in fact, because of this kind of single-minded focus on extremism and that they would line up with authoritarians in the region, which may not be the best thing for us or for people in the region.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, please.
My name is Ibrahim Owais. I'm a former professor at Georgetown University. I have two questions. The first question is about the recent attack on churches and mosques in Egypt, a country that has known to have political stability for many, many years. And the second question is, being an economist, I'm very worried about the fast decline of the purchasing power of the Egyptian pound. The Egyptian pound used to buy $5. Now the dollar is about 18 pounds, and this caused a lot of inflation in Egypt, and many of the poor classes cannot afford living under these conditions. Thank you.
Steve, you wanna, yeah?
Well, Professor Owais, you're never a former professor, from what I'm told. And you get to keep that for the rest of your life. I think, without going into long exegesis of Egyptian politics, I think it's pretty clear that Egypt is an unstable country. And I think that the sectarian problems that are emerging in Egypt have been there for quite some time, and this speaks to the quality of governance in Egypt. It's not, though, radically different from what we've seen before, either during the Sadat, Mubarak, SCAF, Morsi, or now Sisi periods. What you have added to it is precisely what you said, an economic crisis that opens a whole host of questions about how the population will continue to endure this type of economic pain. We do know, however, that, and I think the drift of your question is, will there be another uprising? I don't think anybody knows. These things are absolutely unpredictable. But what we do know about the countries that have experienced uprisings since late 2010 is that they were on actually economic upswings. These were not countries that were, and that speaks to the kind of, bad conventional wisdom after the uprisings, that that economic grievances drove the uprisings. It was a kind of different mix of economic winners, losers, democracy, sense of dignity, social justice that drove the uprising. But I think it goes without saying that Egyptians are suffering, and it goes without saying that the country is unstable, and it goes without saying that we should all be worried about a country that has 91 million people that could very well fail.
Hassan, did you want to add?
And I want to come in.
Yes, just like to say that the gravity of the concerns, Professor, that you mentioned, underline the fact, in terms of Egypt, underline the fact that the typical political landscape and concern of the Egyptian citizen is very much so local. And therefore, the type of questions, I'm linking it back to the poll here, the type of questions that when an Egyptian is asked his or her opinion about what is the cause of the crisis in Yemen or in Syria or in Libya, is akin to a typical US person being asked, what do you think about the crisis in Colombia with the FARC, or in Venezuela so what I'm trying to say is, it's not that there's no idea. There is some idea, but it's really at the background of concerns, and therefore the choice of answers that end up being provided fall within what the political narrative around provides, offers. And this is why I'm saying that it might be more useful to look at this poll, and I'm really trying to bring it back to the matter of the poll, as a measure of the penetration of those narratives, rather than of the opinion of the public about Syria, about Yemen, etc. By the way, both Yemen and Libya are, it's not governance, it's tribalism that ends up being more prominent in the assessment of others. And that is because it's remote, and therefore what do we know about Yemen? That it's tribal and remote and backward. This is the underlying, if you like, unstated maybe opinion here. So what I'm trying to lead to, if we accept the notion that the parochial, local, patrimonial nature of the Arab political landscape, it pushes us in the direction of having to maybe devise further tools in order to have a better understanding. And the reason I'm expressing discomfort is to say that the Arab citizen demands reform, is maybe it's true, but really, in terms of the tools that we have available, I'm not, I don't think we have all the elements. I'm sure Jim disagrees.
You're right. Look, just to go back on the issue of, does it reinforce the existing narrative? There isn't, the options there do not simply suggest a single narrative. Is the problem in Syria too much Iran, too much United States, too much this, or is it the failure of the regime? Those are several different narratives, and they're all at play in the region, and all of them have a policy consequence in terms of what behavior, what policies would be favored by public opinion. Now, if you want to make the argument that public opinion doesn't matter, that's fine, but I think it is instructive for a policymaker to know whether or not there is mass Arab opinion support for more U.S. intervention, and therefore the critique is the U.S. is doing too little in Syria. That's not what people are saying. And they're not blaming the problem on an external force. They're blaming the problem on something internal. That itself is of consequence and I think should be attended to. And when you ask them what the solution is, they are convinced that it should be without Assad. We gave them several options, including a negotiated settlement with Assad. That's not what they chose. Now, I'm not saying this is my preference or that preference. I'm saying this is what people are saying, and there is something important about that, which of the competing narratives they support. Now, on Egypt, we do internal polling in Egypt, although I should say we have done internal polling in Egypt, except after this new law, we may not be able to anymore, and that worries me. I agree with Stephen. This is a country on the brink, and I worry about it. Did you ever see the movie The Square? I saw the movie The Square, and at the end of the movie, we interviewed, we premiered it, and we had the director. I have to tell you, at the end of it, I wasn't inspired, I was exhausted. I understood a sense of Egyptian opinion, which was, oh my God, stop it, just stop it. No more, please. And I also understand that there's a sense of almost a post-traumatic shock in the country. It reminds me of the Three Stooges episode where the word Niagara Falls gets spoken, and whenever it gets spoken, they start to shake and go crazy. You say Muslim Brotherhood, and there is half of Egyptian society that starts to go crazy. You say coup, and they start to go crazy. I mean, they're like buzzwords that set people off. The country is deeply divided. When we polled back in 2013, the military had a 90+% favorable rating. Muslim Brotherhood had when they were in power, had a 25% or so favorable rating. Asked people what's the way forward, 80+% said there should be a national dialogue and reconciliation among competing factions. After Tamarud, we asked them what was their attitude toward the military. It had dropped just a few points. Muslim Brotherhood was about the same. Asked them about what, did you approve of the military taking over, or was there a better course? The better course was 80% still said there should be national dialogue and reconciliation. 2 years later, national reconciliation still was up there. Military had dropped from 93% down to the 70% range. Morsi's number and Sisi's numbers were about the same. And the Muslim Brotherhood numbers favorable were about 48%, double what they had been before. Was that favorable to the Muslim Brotherhood, or was it screw you to the government? I think it was the latter, not the former. But the problem is that Egyptian leadership was in denial. They will not accept the fact that half of their public is in this other camp. And by snuffing out a free press, by snuffing out NGOs and civil society, they're seeking to insulate themselves. And I think they're digging a dangerous, they're on a very dangerous course. I mean, no one wants to see Egypt either explode again or fail, as you warn. But I think that there is a course, and the polling tells us that these are like little warning signs that are here. And I just want to sort of validate what Steve was saying from our numbers.
Thank you. And so we have time for one more question, last question of 2016, and it has to be yes or no, and Hussein and Jim have to agree. Okay, back here, the lady in the blue sweater. Blue jacket.
Hi, Moragop Taylor from the Wilson Center. My question is for Stephen Cook. And anyone else who wants to respond.
Can we, we're not sure that your microphone is working.
Sorry.
I heard my name and I got
I
nervous.
did. Hi, my name is it working now?
No,
Okay,
speak up.
loud. Hi, my name is Laura Goff Taylor from the Wilson Center, and my question is at Stephen. I was wondering what you see the role Turkey will try to play in the region in the next year or two, and what role Turkey might actually be able to play in the region.
Thanks. That's a terrific question. It strikes me that first you have to understand that when current Turkish leadership thinks about foreign policy, and this goes for every government, but I think it's particularly acute at this moment in Turkey, is how is it going to advance a domestic political agenda? So that there is a lot of discussion in Turkey about being a leader in the region, a Muslim leader. That is something actually pretty consistent over a period of time, but this kind of questioning the post-World War I settlements and the Treaty of Lausanne are things that accrue to the domestic political benefit of President Erdogan and his desire to alter the domestic political system to advance his agenda. How they can actually play a role is I think, somewhat more limited. There has been a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. There has been a kind of grudging acceptance of bringing Turkey back into the fold, if only because Turkey is seen as a potent ally against Assad, in which there needs to be a more united front, a player against ISIS. But of course, the Turks have not been as consistent on that issue. And somewhat less when it comes to Iran, because the Turks often have kind of different types of relations with the Iranians. They are at one time strategic competitors with them, but seek better economic relations with the Iranians. So I think that they're constrained by a number of structural factors in the region, and that is, despite this rapprochement, there's not a lot of trust between the major players in the Gulf and Turkey. Obviously, whatever problems the big players in the Gulf have with Egypt, it still is not going to trump, the prospect of better relations with Turkey is not going to trump the rather significant estrangement between Cairo and Ankara. And the Egyptians would work very hard to make sure that that did not happen. So I think that when you see the Turks acting in the region is, as I said before, calculated for domestic political benefit, or a leapfrog to something that will lead to domestic political benefit. But just to underline something that Jim was saying, the Turks have a lot of ideas about their role in the region. The AKP has a lot of ideas about their role, but recognize this is a country that doesn't really have access to its own history in the region, and the AKP has been able to create a narrative about the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and a constructive role, rather than what many Arabs view as a rather destructive role in the world. So there's always going to be some natural resistance, other than that particular moment in 2010, 2011, 2012, with Turkish soft power related to watching television, everyone's position on Palestine, et cetera, accrued to their benefit. At that time, you realize that the pro-Erdogan press, which is now most of the press in Turkey, referred to him as the king of the Arab street. I don't think that king of Saudi Arabia or the king of Jordan would have agreed with that at that moment.
Thank you, and that's the last word. Thank you again to Jim Zogby for sharing with us this extremely interesting polling data. Thank you to a fantastic panel, Hassan and Neha, Ellen Mason, Steve Cook. Thank you most of all to all of you who came out and joined us today. Happy holidays, and we will see you in 2017.